Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up, and the three books we'll be chatting about would be Fury of the Gods, The Bloodless Princes, and Monstrous Nights. All three of these are conclusions to their given series, and as such I can't say too much about the specifics for these individual books. I will give some general thoughts about them, and then I'm more so going to talk about the series themselves. I will have timestamps in the description bar down below in case you'd like to bounce between any of these books, or if you're just interested in one, you can go ahead and skip ahead to that. And then if you are interested in checking any of these out, I'll have them linked in the description bar down below. I'm going to kick it off though with Monstrous Nights. This is the sequel to Foul Days, and this is an adult fantasy duology. The first book, you follow a young woman named Kosara who has grown up her entire life living within the city of Chernograd. And within this city, there are monsters that are able to break into their world through this veil that within the first 12 days of the year is weakened. And in that time, it is very significant for witches to help protect the city, and our main character is one of these witches. However, she has essentially had fear struck into her after enduring some kind of trauma in previous years at the hands of the Czar of Monsters. All of this is essentially revealed to you right within the opening, on top of also discovering that the way in which Kosara has her magic is through her shadow. That is how witches are able to use magic, and if you lose your shadow, if you bargain your shadow away, then you lose your ability to have magic. And because Kosara is so desperate to get rid of the Czar of Monsters at the beginning of the Foul Days, the first 12 days of the year, she ends up bargaining away her shadow to escape the city and go beyond this wall into a city that the wall keeps safe from the monsters, which would include the Tsar himself. That is the setup for the first book. I did feel like the setting was really well realized in that the area with the monsters and the place that Kosara grew up within, once she goes out of that place, it almost feels like the story completely changes in its setting, or that its setting suddenly shifts, which I think is a great way to place you within the character and her experience. And then on top of that, there is almost this murder mystery feel to the story. There's somewhat of like a detective trying to be on the case, which incorporates another of our perspectives that we end up getting in the story. The first book, I thought, balanced out the setting, the world building, and the character work really well. I think the way that we dissected the trauma of the character while simultaneously including some cheeky and funny moments to sort of lighten the mood, I thought that was balanced really well also. And just in general, I thought the writing style was very inviting. This is a debut duology, and I was really impressed by that first book. This second one, I think it definitely leaned more into the investigative side of things, which actually surprised me. I don't know why I didn't anticipate that, but I guess I just was expecting something a little bit different. But we did get a lot more of a mystery detective sort of feel within the second one, which I liked, as that was a part of the first. But I do think the first one was so locked into the fantasy elements, and this is very Eastern European inspired, if that kind of gives you an idea of what the fantasy elements include. And we were so locked into that and Kosara and her past that I feel like the investigative aspects of the story were sort of more of the B plot, you could say. And they did sort of take, not over the second book, but they did sort of take center stage a lot more often. And I, as somebody who hasn't read too much investigative fantasy, detective fantasy, I don't know that I can properly categorize how this feels in comparison to just a regular mystery or thriller, or how it even compares to other fantasy books that fall within that subgenre. I did enjoy it. I do feel like, though, that occasionally some of the pieces of the mystery, you could say, they sort of didn't allow for you to solve or work ahead, and you kind of just had to go with it as it went. I do think that sort of took away from the stakes. I also thought that the stakes were established really well within the first book, and in the second book it almost felt like leftovers from the first book, which meant that the part of the story that actually I found the most enjoyable was the relationship building between the characters, and also just being back in this world and the banter of the characters, because everybody is very snarky, and so I did enjoy that element quite a bit. So anyway, if it's not clear, the first book I think I enjoyed more than the second. I still enjoyed this one quite a bit, and I am absolutely going to be on the lookout for anything that this author puts out in the future. If you are looking for a fun, but also It's fast-paced, but cool world building. It's familiar, but it does unique things with it. And it just kind of feels like a slight shift on some classic Eastern European folklore. If you're looking for something like that, I think that this duology will be a lot of fun. It's got sprinkles of high fantasy without really feeling too daunting. After that, we have the Bloodless Princes. So the first book in this set of, it's a duology as well, and they're both, I would say, more so novella length. Speaking of building off of things that are kind of the foundational pillars of fantasy, but then doing something unique with them, this truly starts out in that place, as the first book is dragon slaying fantasy at its core. However, there's so much to how the author writes the story that's very unique. I've described it before as feeling like a combination of dragon slaying fantasy and psychological horror in a way, because as our main character is descending into the dragon's lair, her grasp on reality seems like it's not as strong, and so then you, as the reader, are like, wait, is she experiencing reality as it is, or is something else going on? And then interspersed throughout the narrative, you get these clips of previous dragon slayers and knights as they describe going into different dragon slayers and what the effects of that, what it was on them and what happened, and if somebody died, what happened to them. And I thought that was really cool, actually. Even though it was such a short amount of time, you would think that that would be an interruption, but to me it was a really cool way to build the stakes and develop the world. It made the world feel very well fleshed out, even though you only get pieces of it. Within this second one, though, I would say that you shift away, certainly, from dragon slaying fantasy. I don't want to say too much else as to why I'm wording it like that, but you start to go more into, I've talked about how there's a creation myth at the beginning of this that I thought was so cool. There's multiple creation myths. You go more into the lore of their world and how that ties into the creation myths, and the after and what happens with all of that. So kind of like creation and death, and you're exploring that a little bit more and how it's all kind of connected to elements from the first one. I think also I liked the first one a little bit more just because I found the whole descending into the dragon's lair aspect so cool, and I just felt like getting introduced to this world was really exciting. But I still really, really enjoyed the second one. I want to be clear, in case it doesn't sound like it, that I did enjoy both of these second installments, even though I liked the first ones a little bit more. But both of these duologies I would definitely recommend. And now finally switching away from duologies and getting to the conclusion of a trilogy that I think a lot of us have been waiting for. We have Fury of the Gods, the third and final book in the Bloodsworn saga by John Gwynne. I think that I should have reread the first two. And the reason I say that is because of how I personally feel John Gwynne structured the series, which I didn't really know until I read the third book, that this was going to sort of be my takeaway of how he builds the story. So in the first book, while I personally think this is high fantasy leaning into epic fantasy, within the first book, it feels a lot more contained than where it ends up, both in the characters, the perspectives, the world, but also the stakes and just how much of the lore actually becomes realized within the series. So within the first book, you're being introduced to everything. You're getting to know these characters. You're getting to know them quite intimately. There are three main perspectives, and I always say I feel like they all stole the spotlight throughout the story. At times, I find in a lot of multiple perspective stories, there's a character that you're like, oh geez, I don't want to follow this guy. And every time you get to him, you're like, no, and you count the pages until you're with a character you like again. I never felt that with these characters, because as soon as one character would start to not be maybe as exciting, another character would suddenly be the person that maybe wasn't as exciting before, but now they're exciting. And then as their plot lines are calming down, someone else's becomes exciting. And then it all becomes explosive. And then you're like, okay, now I need book two. If you're unfamiliar with the setup, you have these three perspectives initially in the first book, and then you do expand and you get additional perspectives. But within book one, you have the three. One of them is a woman whose past does not stay in the past, and it definitely comes back to haunt her. And so now, as a result, she is trying to, one, seek revenge, and two, she is trying to seek someone that she cares very much about. Then you have another individual who seems very ambitious, and what drives them and what they're trying to attain, at first is slightly cloudy and unclear, but then as the story progresses, you're starting to see just how much they're looking to gain. And then the third perspective is a young man who was previously enslaved, escaped that life, joins a group of basically like fighter warrior individuals. They are now trying to also find out what happened to their sister. So these are fairly removed from one another. And I do think within the first book, you get to know these characters quite well. The second book is where I really feel like you're starting to see how the lore becomes so much more a part of the present day story. You're starting to get the motivations of beings, you could say, or individuals who seem so incredibly powerful, and then you're realizing that one character who's ambitious, if you thought she was ambitious, then you just have to wait until some other people enter the picture. And you're also starting to see how all the paths really start to come together. The third book, once everything does start to come together, is where it just becomes explosive. I did feel like we had a lot of action scenes, and for my taste, I think maybe a couple of them could have been cut. Maybe not entirely, but they could have been trimmed perhaps a little bit, because I do think for action scenes to have a lot of impact, you also want to ensure there's something at risk within the scenes. And there were certain times where it just kind of felt like we needed something to up the pacing. But then, if anything, it actually slowed it down for me a little bit, because I just kind of felt like I was waiting for the scene to be complete so that we could get to the next thing, which isn't to say they were poorly written. They were always well written. And it's not to say there are no stakes, because I don't want that to be how it comes across. There are definitely stakes within this story. It's just that the stakes become so big that some of the action scenes were not up against those big threats. It was just like a little hiccup on their way from point A to point B. And you're like, yeah, no, let's just like, I want to get to the big stuff. And you do get to the big stuff. And then it's race to the finish line for a huge portion of the book. I actually waited until I had my audiobook hold in from the library to pick this up. And I was shocked when I was like, I feel like things are going down like already. And I looked at how much time was left and I was like, dude, what's going to happen in this whole last chunk? Is this whole last chunk really going to be this huge battle? And basically, yes. And I didn't mind, because it was breakneck and it felt like we had built to this moment exceptionally. But how I started this all is to say that because it had been a while between when I picked up book 2, which I read around when it came out, and when I picked up this third book, I felt like some of that momentum that I had and some of that care that I had for the characters that was well established in the first 2 books, time just kind of pulled me out of it a little bit. And that's not, in my opinion, a fault of the series, and it's not a fault of this individual book. It's my fault. So if you yourself haven't picked up the series but you're considering it, they are rather big books, each individual one, and I do think they're fairly demanding of your attention, as there are a lot of characters, not necessarily perspectives, but there are a lot of characters that are introduced. I do think that the setting is very well realized, and as a result, there are a fair amount of things that are going to take your concentration, and you really have to make sure you're locked in and you know who's who and what's what. So I would encourage that if you haven't started it, that you set aside time to try to read the entire trilogy as close to back as possible, at the very least to not wait too long between entries. And then if you have read, like me, if you'd read the first 2 books and you want to read this third one, even though he does write little reminders of the story up until this point, even though that's included, I would advise that you reread the first 2 books, or at the very least maybe do a pretty strong recap for yourself, just to get yourself back in it a little bit stronger than I did. Anyway, if you have any additional thoughts about Fury of the Gods or any of the books that I mentioned, feel free to talk about that in the comments down below. As I said at the beginning, I'll have links to all of these in the description bar in case you're interested. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.